So it is my great pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Sheila Jasanoff from the Harvard Kennedy School, the key voice in science technology studies. I think somebody who's been a wonderful intellectual agonist in basically everything she does, but in particular in gene editing, where there has been a lot of smoke, some fire, but they're not always in the same place. So Professor Jasanoff is going to speak for a period of time, and then I'm going to join her on the dais. We're going to have a conversation, and we're going to invite others into the conversation. So let me turn it over to Professor Jasanoff.
Thank you, Glenn. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for being here on a Friday afternoon, though it's probably better to be out of the snow. So Glenn said I was going to speak. I'm going to try to speak, so I should warn you in advance that I've got this recalcitrant cough, and it's kind of unpredictable when it chooses to act up and when not. So if I have to stop and drink tea, please bear with me. So the idea was that I would set the stage slightly, and then we would have a conversation with Glenn. And I was given the small topic of international responses to gene editing. So obviously the right way to approach this would have been to have a map of every single response that fits under that heading of international, but that's not, in fact, the way that I've been approaching it and thinking about it. So instead, I thought I would give a little bit more of a conceptual introduction, raising the kinds of issues that I think will need to be addressed if we ever end up with some kind of a common convention or common agreement on the status of particularly the human genome, but of course there are other genomes that still could be thought of as potentially common property of humankind, and how should we think about these issues. So we are in a law place, and law likes definitions, and one might begin with this very question of international. So who actually defines the space that we call international? And so far, at least the discussion in this country, in the US, has been led by science. So there have been 2 international summits, so-called already, and they were international in that they were organized by a troika of main scientific research academies from 3 countries, US, UK, and China. And these meetings happened, one in DC in 2015, and then another in 2018 in Hong Kong. And that was the one that created some of the smoke and the fire, because that was the meeting at which He Jiankui announced that he had created these CRISPR twins, or CRISPR babies, as they have been widely called. So international raises immediately the question about who is defining the forum, who is creating the invitation lists, the process questions, how should this be being done, and not insignificantly, what should be discussed when we're thinking about an international forum at which some of the gravest questions about ownership, about rights, responsibilities, obligations, accountability in potentially transforming the human genome are under discussion at all. Now, the next thing you will not be able to read at all from a distance, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the organizing committee. You see the bolded names are the names of the individuals, and you see not many people are involved. And about half of them come from Anglophone countries. So the US is heavily represented, and there's Australia and the UK. There is one person from South Korea, there's one person from India. The China representation, although it looks like a couple of people, is a little bit more intensive when you recognize that a number of the Anglophone researchers already have a heavy presence in the Chinese research world and are conducting part of their research in China anyway. If you did a kind of network analysis, which of course one could in various ways, you would find that the members of this organizing committee are not accidentally related to one another. So the names keep cropping up. Someone like Robin Lovell Badge from the UK has been present in every genome editing meeting. Someone like, well, I mean, you could go down the names on this list and discover similar sorts of properties for a number of people, like Alter Charo, for instance, from the US. After that second international summit, the committee issued a statement, as is conventionally done at the end of any summit. And there were some interesting turns of speech that are worth focusing on to some extent. The first thing that they recommended was a proposed translational pathway. So those of you who are working on medicine-related things know that the word translational means bench to bedside, from idea to application, from research to clinic. It means taking what you know and already beginning to apply it. Now, in the previous summit, the conclusion had been that since the human genome is the property not of any one of us, but of humankind more broadly, that there needed to be, the terminology was introduced by Eric Lander of our own Broad Institute, or at least Eric takes credit for it, a broad societal consensus on how we should proceed to work with the human genome. That broad societal consensus language was simply and silently put aside. So it is a real question for us, if we think about summits and their outputs as being a kind of agreement that implicitly people have bought into, what is the nature of the authorization that allows the second summit simply to set aside important verbiage from the first summit and not provide any explanation, and instead start talking about a translational pathway. So the translational pathway language, of course, assumes that, okay, the sort of basic problems of the basic research are kind of settled, or at least we know how to deal with them. Our attention should now focus on the translational pathway, how to get into the clinic and how to do the applications. But if the fundamental questions of should we do this and how far should we go remain unsettled, then it's at the very least premature to start talking about translational pathways. So whether you see this as premature or not, discursively in linguistic terms, the second summit simply decides that the chapter can be closed, the book can be closed on the initial questions that were relevant to the broad societal consensus. It's as if they have decided, okay, that broad societal consensus already exists, that there should be translation. And now the question is simply how to go forward. And they recommend, in the second paragraph, an independent assessment of the conditions under which this translation should occur. And they also recommend an ongoing international forum to supervise the ethical and other dimensions, risk dimensions of the translational pathway that they're calling for. All right, so, you know, at one level, it's perfectly, I mean, this is completely consistent with a kind of biomedical model of how we go forward when we believe that the ethics questions are now localized between physician and patient, and then, you know, the question is how you have ongoing monitoring and oversight of a set of things they've already decided to do. But what gets swept under the carpet in this way of going about doing business, where the scientists, in effect, have called the international summit into being and have decided how to frame the questions and how to discuss the issues that are to be put before the decision-making bodies. So the dominant scientific narrative can be seen as being something like this. First of all, basic research presents a different set of moral and ethical problems from clinical research, and implicitly they say we've already dealt with the ones that are at the basic research end, and now we need to evolve something more of a regulatory structure that looks at the clinical research. Moreover, there's a presumption, which you can see over and over again in the kinds of statements that people make, that novelty, to the extent that new things, processes, procedures, ways of intervening are being introduced into the world, scientists are good enough at handling that kind of novelty as long as the third-party risks are mitigated in some sense. And those risks are seen as physical, biological risks to health, safety, and the environment. So there's a widespread assumption that to the extent there are risks to health, safety, or the environment, we do need a regulatory structure. That's when we turn to the state, but not unless those kinds of risks exist. Moreover, there's a widespread assumption, again present in many, many statements made by the members of this kind of group, that the political effects, the political objections that people often have at the threshold of introducing new and emerging technologies eventually take care of themselves. Those of you who've been exposed in any way to technology studies will recognize this as a technologically determinist position, that ultimately the flow of the technology ends up determining what society is willing to accept or not, that it is a general fact that people are afraid of new things, unfamiliar things, and once they get used to it, then they accept it. A canonical example that many of you will be extremely well aware of is the case of in vitro fertilization. And when it was first introduced, the test tube baby, even the term suggested some kind of monstrous appearance into the world. And fertility clinics, people who carry out IVF, will often say, look, people were so scared of this, and initially it was thought that only a very tiny handful of really difficult pregnancies would be avoided or created by these means, or supplemented by these means. But look, now there are upwards of 6 million babies being born through IVF, and we think nothing of it. And there are clinics in all kinds of countries and practices everywhere, and our attention has shifted to other things. So IVF is often told in these terms as a story where naturalization has occurred. What we used to think of as unnatural has now become the new natural, and people accept it because that naturalization also makes our understanding of what is normal into something else, and therefore we no longer see it as odd or foreign or with particular ethical concern. And then what do we need? So fear is evanescent. It is caused by the unfamiliar. All we need is a bit of time and getting people, maybe a decent amount of communication of exactly how these things work. And in the end, people will come around and see that they didn't need to be afraid. And ultimately, reason will prevail and people will converge around the utility of these new technologies. This is an exceedingly powerful narrative. It governs the introduction of new and emerging technologies all over the place. So if you were to read about self-driving cars, and if you were to read about gene editing, you would find something of the same narrative structure, regardless of what the thing is that's being introduced. And that already should make us a little bit suspicious, because it suggests that there are no moral differences between technologies, whether we're introducing a new kind of energy technology, whether we're geoengineering the planet, whether we're editing the human genome, or whether we're introducing a self-driving car, that this narrative prevails across all of them. And yet I think a little bit of stopping and reflecting will suggest that that narrative may need to be modified, given that the objectives, the purposes, the endpoints are really strikingly different across these different domains of application. So what does the dominant paradigm, as I've laid it out for you, the dominant set of assumptions is tacit. It's there if you're attuned to it, if you're looking for it, if you do research on these kinds of things, as I do. But equally important to ask is, what does that narrative ignore? And there are some kind of important things that get lost and ignored. One is that there isn't a blank slate. In fact, there are international agreements and other bits and pieces of law and practice that already have something to do with editing the human genome. Maybe the most powerful example is the Oviedo Convention, which brought together something on the order of 30 countries that signed on to a version of the convention that includes Article 13, intervention on the human genome, and it says, an intervention seeking to modify the human genome may only be undertaken for preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes, and only if its aim is not to introduce any modification in the genome of any descendants. So that immediately blocks out germline gene editing as a no-go territory, and one would at least have to consider in this translational pathway idea what to do about those countries that simply think you should not go there. Is it now the ethical landscape of the world that some countries think you should not be doing this at all and therefore will not go there, whereas other countries think it's perfectly okay to do it and they will do it? So we will have a world that's divided between countries or places where germline genome edited people exist, and others where they don't exist, and some places where there is a moral barrier, other places where there isn't. You will recognize that the attempt to create that kind of a world around abortion has not worked in this country. So why should it work with genome editing? It's at least worth our thinking about in some sense. More deeply, we might ask whether the visions of science and scientific progress that animate what this international summit has been doing is subject to any kind of analysis through the lens of what I call civic epistemologies. So it's been shown through comparative work that countries and cultures differ in the ways in which they accept what is reasonable and what counts as proof, what counts as evidence. So, for instance, the whole idea of science being independent, that's encoded into the idea of an independent assessment of the risks and benefits of genome editing, would not be accepted in many countries that believe that science is always embedded in society and in moral and political contexts, and that you shouldn't be seeking independence, you should be seeking, if anything, more embeddedness and a deeper attempt to canvass the different points of view that exist in a society with regard to science. So just by using that terminology of an independent assessment, the International Summit is giving back American civic epistemology, which has classically separated fact from value and acted as if the domain of facts, the domain of truth-finding, is completely independent of normative substrates or underlying normative commitments. And then there's the question of philosophical traditions, which, of course, again, you in this room are well aware of, that these do go back to very different understandings of how we weigh the purposes and the costs and the benefits of moving forward with something. Cost-benefit analysis is not an appropriate way to frame what the issues are if you're in more of a deontological framework. In very basic terms, are you thinking of the benefits flowing to the individual, or are you thinking about it in relational terms as well? So is the risk of IVF, of human germline gene editing, related to the risks to the individual genome that's being tinkered with, or does it depend on some set of broader societal understandings of what it does to familial relationships, group dynamics, and even the spread of traits over an entire population that might come into question in some sense. So these are issues that were simply not on the table in the kind of deliberations that have been had at this international summit. So just, how can one propose a different way of going about this? So if we are firmly convinced that the international debate so far has been international only through the exercise of a kind of framing that takes some internationalisms as being more important than others, and some forms of debate, some ways of framing questions as more significant than others, how would we go about proposing an alternative? So the first argument that people put forward against this is that the cat is out of the bag, the genie is out of the bottle, and if we don't do it, China will. That seems to be the sort of going mantra of the day. But one has to take a position against it. I mean, is the fact that someone has already taken the lead, if they have, I mean, there's a factual question there as well, but just because somebody has done it, does it mean that we now have to accept that as the new baseline? There are many, many areas of regulatory law where we do not believe that just because somebody has gone out and done something, therefore it's okay. I mean, in the area of climate geoengineering, for instance, there have been a couple of so-called rogue attempts to go off and do experiments that are not authorized according to going ethical ideas about how to intervene in the environment. Those episodes have not led all of the climate researchers to say, oh, it's fine, so-and-so took his iron filings out into the Pacific Ocean and even duped Noah into giving him some equipment for doing his work, but now that he's done it, it's okay, we should all do it. Nobody's saying that. I mean, so why do we say it in the context of the human genome? The concept of slow science has been accepted and adopted in a variety of quarters, both as a policy idea and as an ethical idea, that we should not be conducting science independent of the attempt to develop the ethical principles in accordance with which the science should be done. The idea of inclusive deliberation, that again has become a term of art, that the deliberation, as I pointed out for the international summits, has been anything but inclusive, not inclusive internationally, not inclusive interdisciplinarily, not inclusive even intersectorally, that is, patient groups, scholars from disciplines other than molecular biology and so forth. So what about the voices from the margins, which include all of those things, disciplines, regions, social groups, and even religious traditions that have a lot to say about the meaning of genome editing? And then what should the objectives of creating a new deliberative space be? And I think one of the important things is to go back to a very simple thing that one is taught in policy schools, that it's not the quality of the answer that decides on the wisdom, or that determines the wisdom of the policy, it's the quality of the question. So you can have the best possible, the most rigorous possible answer to the wrong question, and it will still not help you solve the right problems in the world. So are we asking the right questions, and how do we even begin to ask the right questions? If you stick a bunch of clinical researchers together and say, what is the problem of intervening in the human genome, they will go down the translational pathway route, because that is what they've been taught, and they will decide that these are the things that we need to develop. But if you go to someone who thinks that the human genome is the work of God, that person may have a very different idea of what to intervene in and what not. So starting points matter. And I think we have to cultivate this posture of what a group of thinkers, including myself, have referred to as radical hospitality. I mean, that is not a kind of Rawlsian attempt to shut out certain positions as inconsistent with public reason, but rather to admit that there are positions that may be extremely foreign, that you do not want to shut out simply because the stakes are so important. We're talking about a common future of humankind. And that, in turn, would lead to a kind of ethics that would be far more cosmopolitan, recognizing that there are multiple different starting points and multiple different analytic positions from which to start analyzing what is implied in the attempt to tinker with this most fundamental property that we now recognize ourselves as having, the human genome. So I'll just conclude this part of the conversation by saying that what we have proposed, my colleagues and I, is what we call a global observatory, and it would have these functions. It would enlarge the nature of representation. It would explicitly lead to an opening up of the set of questions, and it would accommodate voices that are not present currently in the more prominent science-led or bioethics-led deliberations that are taking place in the world. In the conversation with Glenn, I'm sure we'll get into this because, of course, one can have a grand idea and then people want to know the very next day, well, how are you going to bring this into being? That may not be your questions. You may have other ones. But let me conclude the formal part of the presentation there and move on to something a bit more informal.
Thank you very much. So we'll definitely open it up to questions probably in about 6 or 7 minutes, but I thought I'd take the opportunity just to lead a bit of an early part of the conversation. And so, Professor Jasanoff, I wanted to start with the obsession over the what I call the M word of moratorium. So never before have I thought that so many non-lawyers would obsess over a term that is very unclear in and of itself. I can't believe the amount of ink that has been spilled on should we have a moratorium? Do we already have a moratorium? What is meant by a moratorium? What is intended? I'm curious what you make about this level of discourse. Is it just an attempt to skirt issues by having kind of legal formalistic sounding things?
Thanks, Glenn. So one approach that comes naturally to an STS scholar and actually also to a lawyer is to say precedent. I mean, so where else has the term moratorium been used, and how has it been used there? And even a question like, do we already have one, might be tested against already existing examples. So there are two examples I know that are kind of significant in this context. One is the de facto moratorium on the building of nuclear power plants in this country. It was not caused by an agreement. Nobody officially came together, but for different reasons, the nuclear industry, the public, and government agreed that there would not be any construction of new nuclear power plants. And, it's breaking down ever so slightly, but not to the tune of actually creating new sites. I mean, more an additional reactor or two, perhaps, in a site that already exists. And even that very cautiously. So what would we take away from that example? I mean, I think we would take away that as far as the American public is concerned, fundamental questions about what we do with the residue, the detritus of nuclear power, have not yet been resolved. And a recognition on the part of the industry that if they tried to dig a hole and build a power plant, they would meet a kind of resistance that would render it impossible. With therapeutic interventions, things are more individualized and more invisible. So whether people would rise up or not is a real question. But they might, as in the Jesse Gelsinger case that produced a de facto moratorium on gene therapy. But the other one that I was thinking about was Asilomar, where there was an official agreement on the part of molecular biologists that they would have a couple of years of moratorium and not actually engage in genetic engineering until they came back together and decided how to go forward. So in the case of that moratorium, the same people that called it also ended it. There was never a determination as to what ought to happen in between. And I think that part of the confusion about the moratorium on gene editing is that nobody has actually bothered to say, are we talking about a politically induced moratorium because this is a heartfelt area where we intrude at our peril and we may be able to get away with doing this or that, but too many mistakes and then the world will clamp down and we will just not have access to the power to develop this technology at all. That could be one scenario. Or whether we're saying the much more pragmatic and instrumental thing that, look, it worked with Asilomar, so let's just placate the public by throwing them the salve of a moratorium suggesting that we thought about it, and then 2 years later just come back and start doing things. Now, obviously, neither fits the model of deliberation that you or I might consider to be ideal in a complex world, and certainly not at the international level either.
I think that's very well said. My next question is about this question about what deliberation might look like. And in particular, I guess I'll frame the question this way. One could imagine engaging in a bunch of deliberative democracy kinds of exercises, citizen juries. There's been some that have been done. I guess Australia is doing a consultation in MRT right now. There are a few of these going on. That's kind of one model, although I think it's very nationalistic as models go. I take the Global Observatory idea to have a somewhat different DNA, and I want to just invite you to say a little bit more about what good quality deliberation might look like here, not at the level of brass tacks, exactly how to implement it, but whether there are models of things you've seen in other areas of science or other areas of policy making that you like or that you would approve of as kind of DNA for what you have in mind.
Yeah, thanks. I think the observatory is in the nature of what I, in my own theoretical universe, call an imaginary. That is, I imagine it, and it doesn't exist, and there isn't a real model for exactly what it should be, but it's based on the non-existences of the world. So if you could imagine an architecture that says, look, here are the different silos that we've built, and here are the palaces and the the diplomatic havens and so forth. What is not there, and what would an architecture look like that actually brought those non-speaking spaces together? That would be, it's difficult to imagine, but there are pieces of it that one can talk about. So in our own sort of going brand of political philosophy, we have an idea of what the rational public sphere consists of, and whether you follow Habermas or whether you follow Rawls, there is a sense that some things are just too, whether they're private or idiosyncratic or located in particular historical contingencies, that they should not be allowed to contaminate some presumed world of ideal reason. So, for instance, when I've presented my comparative research on Germany and the US in high-level meetings, of things like the National Academy of Sciences, saying, look, Germans actually recognize for all practical purposes that life begins at the moment of conception, which we have not recognized in America as a matter of constitutional law. And yet, their abortion policies are way more favorable to women and way more flexible than our abortion policies are. Shouldn't we somehow try to understand this? And, somehow invariably within 2 sentences, somebody will say, well, it's the Holocaust, isn't it? But that's a way of saying there is a contingency of German history that explains why they are the aberrant ones and we are the rational ones. And in that sense, I see my field as saying, sorry, you can't go there. You got to estrange your own culture in the same way you're estranging other people's cultures, and begin again from equal understandings of the strangeness of all of these achievements. And so deliberation, to me, first would require that kind of brush clearing to establish what are the historical prerequisites and assumptions out of which this thing makes sense. And then we can engage in the different forms of sense-making, and maybe we would find areas where we do agree. I mean, after all, negotiation theorists have dealt with this for a long time. Not that I think that human germline genome editing should be given to the proponents of getting to yes. I mean, that's not my idea of what the observatory would do. But nevertheless, when I have been told with a straight face by esteemed colleagues from this university that they went to India and could not find a bioethicist, right? I mean, look, this is a tradition that has actually produced words like Atman that are even incorporated into Western thought as ways of thinking about the self? I mean, do we really want to claim that there is no bioethics in India? Or do we want to claim that a certain thing called bioethics has grown up in this country that only recognizes itself? And what would happen if that bioethics were put in conversation with a different bioethics, one that did not start in those same places and maybe would not go to the same places either? So, that is my sort of dream and vision. But I'm also, as a colleague once pointed out to me, a kind of Brit pragmatist, maybe this is the sort of residue of the Raj. I'm willing to take small steps. And I think that we have been doing that. I mean, Glenn, you yourself were a participant in one of those a couple of years ago when we held a meeting here, and come May of 2020, we're organizing a meeting in Germany that will be a launch episode for the Observatory, where we're going to bring together people from at least the continental and the non-continental philosophical traditions in order to think about issues like human integrity and what meaning those terms have. And we had a little pilot meeting last summer in Berlin, or this past summer in Berlin, and two things stand out from that meeting. One of my British colleagues said he really thinks that human integrity is a term that should be set aside. It does more damage than good. And I wondered, okay, fine, but what does this mean? That you're not going to talk to your German colleagues who are saying, sorry, we have it in the Constitution and we've got to talk in those terms? I mean, regardless of whether you in Britain think that this is a non-term. I mean, that's not an example of radical hospitality. I mean, you would need to think about it differently. And then one person said from the German Ethics Commission that in their new, relatively recent report on genome editing, they said no unauthorized, or that wasn't the term, I mean, it's no impermissible interventions or no impermissible instrumentalizations of the human should be tolerated, something like that. And the French colleague who was sitting at the same table said, I don't know what you mean by an impermissible instrumentalization. For us, all instrumentalization is by definition impermissible. So here was a French person talking to a German person, surely coming from broadly overlapping philosophical traditions, disagreeing on a very basic concept of instrumentalization. And the German person said, well, if you get into an Uber car, you've instrumentalized the driver because you're giving instructions, but the driver is gaining something from your serving you, and therefore it's not an impermissible instrumentalization. Now, we might there launch into contract theory and talk about principal and agent and, have a different analysis, a different unpacking of this. But it was a mini object lesson in how even very close neighbors, when they get into deliberation on really significant terminology, will discover differences between them that they didn't even know they had.
It's very helpful. I want to make sure that if people do have questions, they can come up to the mic. We have a few more minutes. While people are pondering it, but I think we'll have one. I wanted to go back to where you started, which I find something very curious that you observe, which I think is correct, is the amount of sweat and discussion about human genome editing and the lack thereof of animal or other kinds of entities genome editing, whereas in fact what I think is the most threatening in the short term and actual safety terms is the non-human stuff myself, just because I think it's much more likely to be occurring. So I'm curious whether you have views about this. But let's take a question first, and then we can, Ellie, why don't you go ahead if you have a question, please.
Now I have a question on this. There is no oversight process of the embryo modification process in vitro in basic science phase in this country. And I wonder how it happens. Is this because of the scientific narrative or the private sector research, embryonic research was outside with the federal regulation with the legal legacy, or is there any lack of deliberation? I'd like to know.
So the question was about the lack of oversight in the preclinical period and why in the United States we have such a free hand preclinically and in the basic science side of this.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and it's partly because of a strong sense of when this question of instrumentalization arises. So if you're not doing clinical research, then the feeling is that you don't have a human subject at the other end of your intervention. And we have constructed, as you know, our ethics bodies to be extremely attentive to human subjects research. I mean, that is not a very ancient formation. It's actually only since the 1970s that we've been creating that, but still in all the sensitivity has focused on whether you have a human subject at the end. So if the scientists are declaring that the embryo, for instance, the embryo that's been created only for research purposes, or the embryo that does not have the capacity to develop into a full-fledged living being, is not a human subject, that is an ontological dividing line. And therefore, it is felt that you have no ethical obligations towards this inanimate matter. You can do whatever you want with inanimate matter. I do think it relates to Glenn's question because it relates very firmly to how we draw the lines in the world of when we think something is entitled to being treated as life and when not. So you could imagine having a different idea of the embryo, whether it develops or not. You could think that it has an intrinsic sacredness because it is a fully formed informational database that could, in principle, have become a human being, and so it's entitled to a different kind of respect. You could imagine living in that world, right? But that's not the world that we live in the US. We have had this basic research, applied research separation in our policy system for a very, very long time. It's to ensure that scientists have relative autonomy in deciding what research questions they will pursue, but not at the point where they start intervening with another human being or a potential human being. This is why the 14-day rule, for instance, has been very useful to scientists because it allows them a free hand, before the 14 days and not after the 14 days. And until quite recently, people have been satisfied with that. But I think that kind of ontological boundary drawing, that is, some things are entitled to respect, other things are not. Some forms of life are real life, other forms of life are not. That is where this division begins.
With apologies to Phoebe, I see we're over time, so I'm going to call it quits here. Please, a big round of applause, Professor Jasanoff.